On Christmas Day in 1991, while many American families were still gathered around their trees and presents, Willie Nelson received the news that his son, Billy, had ended his own life at the age of 33. It was not a sudden accident, not a long illness, but a desperate choice that cut straight into the heart of a father who had already lived too long with loss. For Willie Nelson, it was not only a family tragedy, it was the moment when every glory, every round of applause, every hit song that had once moved America suddenly felt cruelly small. The man with the braided hair, the guitar named Trigger, and the smile that seemed as if nothing could ever knock him down had in truth lived a life far from peaceful. He had been left behind by his parents when he was still very young, growing up in poverty among the sunburned cotton fields of Texas, writing timeless songs while struggling himself with hunger, debt, and the contempt of Nashville. He became a legend with a voice once criticized as unsuitable, with songs that made the whole world tremble with emotion, and with the almost stubborn endurance of a man who refused to disappear. Yet, the higher Willie Nelson climbed, the more painfully the contradictions of his life were revealed. A man who wrote about love, but repeatedly saw his own homes fall apart, a symbol of freedom who was once squeezed to the brink by the government, an old man who always smiles on stage while carrying wounds that have never truly closed. And perhaps it is precisely there that the real story of Willie Nelson truly begins. The Christmas tragedy of that year was not the first time in his life that Willie Nelson had been forced to confront the feeling of loss. Long before fame, money, or brightly lit stages entered his life, the boy named Willie had already grown accustomed to watching the people who were supposed to stay quietly walk away. Willie Hugh Nelson was born on April 29, 1933 in Abbott, like a small town in Texas, where dust always clung to shoes and cotton fields stretched all the way to the horizon. The moment of his birth also came during the harshest years of the Great Depression. The Nelson family was no exception to the hardship. They lived on whatever the land could give and on nearly endless labor. Yet poverty was not the hardest part. When Willie was still very young, his mother left. There was no long explanation, no clear promise of the day she might return. Not long afterward, his father remarried and began a new life somewhere else. Willie and his sister Bobby were left with their grandparents, as if the two children were simply a fragment of memory forgotten in that dusty little town. Willie's grandparents were not wealthy, but they were resilient in the way of people who had lived through crisis and war. Their small house had few comforts, thin walls, cold winters, and food that was sometimes scarce. Yet inside that house, there existed something Willie would carry with him for the rest of his life: music. His grandfather was the first person to place a guitar in the boy's hands when Willie was about 6 years old. The instrument was almost too large for his small arms, its strings stiff and painful against his fingertips. But it gave Willie a sense of steadiness that the world around him could not provide. Before long, even that rare pillar disappeared. His grandfather died of pneumonia while Willie was still a child. That loss was not merely another name added to the long list of people who had left the boy's life. It made Willie understand that even the ones who stayed could be taken away at any moment. That fragile awareness seeped into his childhood and quietly shaped a very particular kind of resilience, a refusal to expect too much stability from the world. Life in Abbott demanded that children work like adults. The long, scorching summers in the cotton fields became an inseparable part of Willie's memory. His small fingers were cut by dry cotton husks, his back aching from bending for hours, dust and sweat mixing under the relentless Texas sun. It was not an unusual experience for rural life at the time, but for Willie, it carried a clear lesson. If he wanted to survive, he had to keep moving forward, no matter how exhausted he felt. When night fell, Willie's life shifted into a different rhythm. Instead of fields and manual labor, the boy sat with his guitar. Music quickly became the only place where he could put emotions he did not yet know how to name. Willie wrote his first song when he was just 7 years old. Simple, awkward melodies, yet already filled with a loneliness a child should never have to understand so early. By the time he was 9 or 10, he had begun playing in local bands and performing at small gatherings, churches, or anywhere people were willing to listen. In those moments, the boy who had once been left behind in a small town suddenly discovered something strange. When he held the guitar and began to sing, people looked at him as if he truly belonged there. And that feeling of acceptance, even if it lasted only for a few brief songs, it was powerful enough to push Willie Nelson forward, long before most of the world even knew his name. The sense of acceptance Willie Nelson felt during small performances in Texas was not enough to keep him in Abbott. In 1960, Willie Nelson drove to Nashville with almost nothing to his name, carrying a few demo recordings, a guitar, and the belief that if his songs were honest enough, they would eventually find their place. Nashville at that time was the center of American country music, where record labels and studios shaped the taste of the entire nation. Willie entered the city not as a future star, but as a hired songwriter trying to survive. His first opportunity came through Pamper Music, where he worked as a staff songwriter. The melodies he wrote during sleepless nights quickly reached the hands of singers who already held firm positions in the industry. Hello Walls, recorded by Farron Young, climbed to #1 on the country charts in 1961. Funny How Time Slips Away, sung by Billy Walker, also became a hit. Then Crazy, recorded by Patsy Cline, turned into one of the most covered country songs of all time. Nightlife was brought to the stage by Ray Price. Pretty Paper, through Roy Orbison, became a familiar holiday song, and Family Bible was a major success even though Willie had sold the rights too early just to pay his bills. Those songs gradually came to be viewed as part of the American songbook, recorded again and again by later generations. And yet Willie Nelson's name still appeared only in small print within the songwriting credits. The city had heard him, but it had not seen him. When he tried standing in front of the microphone as a singer, Willie was repeatedly judged as unsuitable for the polished Nashville sound that dominated the era. Producers criticized his slow phrasing, the way he often fell behind the beat as if he were speaking rather than performing. They said his voice was too rough, lacking the smoothness and shine required for radio. What producers called a flaw was in fact the unique style taking shape within him, singing as if sitting at a kitchen table late at night, without bright lights, without an elegant string section behind him. Even so, Willie signed his first recording contracts, first with Liberty Records, then Monument Records, and later RCA Records. He released albums such as And Then I Wrote and Country Willie His Own Songs, trying to interpret the songs that had already become famous through other voices. The records found modest footing but did not create a commercial breakthrough. Sales were enough to allow him to keep recording, but not enough to place him among the leading names. In 1965, Willie joined the Grand Ole Opry, a prestigious milestone for any country artist. He began to be known more widely as a singer, appearing on that historic stage with short hair and a neatly tailored suit. Yet he was still not the name the crowd mentioned first. While his songs traveled far, his private life began to fracture. The royalty payments did not arrive as quickly as the charts he had climbed as a songwriter. Endless travel, late-night drinking after shows, returning home late, and dreams far too large for a small kitchen slowly pulled apart his marriage to Martha Matthews. She remained behind with the children and the bills, while he remained with his guitar and songs that carried his name yet did not truly belong to him. Nashville gave him the title of songwriter, but it did not give him the sense of completeness. of a man able to provide security for his family. And in that city of music, Willie Nelson kept writing, kept signing contracts, kept standing on stage, while the emptiness within his own life quietly grew larger. The pressure of Nashville did not only wear down Willie Nelson's professional confidence, it also made him gradually feel as though he were living inside a shirt that had become too tight. In early 1970, his home in Ridgetop suddenly caught fire. The flames spread quickly, devouring wood, papers, memories, manuscripts, and the objects he had gathered over many years. Willie rushed into the blaze to rescue whatever he could carry out, including his guitar and even the marijuana he never tried to hide using. The image would later be retold many times, sometimes with a touch of humor, but the moment itself was far from lighthearted. Standing there watching the house burn down to ashes, Willie did not only lose a home. He realized he had also lost the old version of himself. Nashville had once been a dream, and now it had become a place that made him feel forced into a mold. The carefully arranged orchestras, the demands to sound proper, the glossy layers of polished production increasingly made his own voice feel unfamiliar to him. The fire felt like a door slammed shut, forcing him to choose either to keep adapting or to return and find the music that once allowed him to breathe. Willie chose to leave. He returned to Texas with his guitar, a little money, and the feeling that if he stayed in Nashville any longer, he would disappear inside his own voice. Austin in the early 1970s was nothing like Nashville. The college town was alive with counterculture, with young audiences who did not want to hear country music polished to perfection. They wanted raw guitar sounds, lyrics that felt like storytelling, truth rather than refinement. When Willie stepped onto stages in places like Armadillo World headquarters, he no longer had to wear a suit or sing precisely to radio standards. He let his hair grow long, let his beard grow freely, and played music the way he wanted. And for the first time in years, the audience did not ask him to become any version other than himself. The name outlaw country began to circulate in that atmosphere. Willie did not suddenly transform into a rebel. He had already been an outsider since the years when Nashville criticized his voice. And only when Austin opened its doors did that difference finally find allies. Waylon Jennings was also trying to escape the tight control of record labels. Chris Christopherson carried the spirit of a poet who refused to bend. Billy Joe Shaver wrote songs sharp as knives. They were not an organized group with a formal manifesto, but they shared the same feeling of constraint and decided to redefine country music in their own way. In 1973, the album Shotgun Willie appeared like a declaration that Willie Nelson would not return to the old path. The album was not loud on the charts, but it laid the foundation for a new image, freer, less compromising, closer to Texas than to Nashville. A year later, Phases and Stages emerged as a concept album about divorce, telling the story of a broken relationship from both sides. In it, Willie did not merely sing. He stepped into the role of a man looking back at his shattered marriage with acknowledgement and regret. The album's tight structure and emotional consistency showed that he was not just a songwriter capable of writing individual hits, but an artist able to build a long narrative through music. By 1975, Red-Headed Stranger was released amid skepticism. And the recording was so sparse that many people at the label believed it was too thin, too minimal in instrumentation, too uncommercial to sell. Willie insisted on keeping the simple recording almost exactly as it was, refusing to layer it with the dense arrangements they demanded. When the album was released, what happened went far beyond anyone's expectations. More than 2 million copies were sold. Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain climbed to #1 on the country charts and brought Willie Nelson the first Grammy Award of his career. No longer the man writing songs for others to shine, he became the name printed in large letters on posters, on radio playlists, and on major stages. And this time, he did not have to change his voice or the way he phrased his songs to achieve it. The success of Red-Headed Stranger had barely settled when in 1976, Willie Nelson's name appeared again in a project that felt like a collective declaration, Wanted, The Outlaws. The album brought together Willie Nelson, Waylon Jennings, Jesse Coulter, and Tom Paul Glazer. And it was more than just a musical release. It confirmed that those once considered misfits had now become the center of attention. Wanted. The Outlaws became the first country album in history to be certified platinum, selling more than 1 million copies at a time when the market was still unaccustomed to numbers like that. The Cowboys, once seen as rebels, were no longer standing outside the system. They forced the system to change around them. For Willie, it was the moment he not only achieved personal victory, but also witnessed the movement he helped ignite reach commercial triumph. Yet Willie Nelson was never someone satisfied with repeating himself, when many expected him to continue deepening the outlaw image. In 1978, he turned toward a direction that made both record executives and friends uneasy. Stardust was not pure country, but a collection of classic pop standards from earlier decades, songs once associated with Frank Sinatra or Nat King Cole. Many warned that an artist at the peak of the outlaw movement would damage his credibility by singing such old-fashioned love songs. Willie recorded them in his own way, simple, slightly behind the beat, almost whispered. The result surpassed every doubt. Stardust sold more than 5 million copies, remained on the country charts for years, and expanded his audience beyond genre boundaries. Willie was no longer just a symbol of Texas or the outlaw movement. He stepped into the broader space of American music, where his voice could rest upon almost any melody without losing its identity. In the early 1980s, that image continued to spread when Willie appeared in the film Honeysuckle Rose. He did not play someone very different from himself, a musician traveling endlessly on the road, living between stage lights and nights far from home. From that film came On the Road Again, which quickly became one of his signature songs. The track climbed high on the charts. It was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Original Song and earned him another Grammy Award. Its cheerful melody concealed a reality that was far from easy. Willie's life truly existed on the road, with tours stretching endlessly, cities passing by the bus window, and family often remaining only a brief memory between two performances. In 1982, Willie Nelson reached another commercial peak with Always on My Mind. The song had already been recorded by several artists before, but Willie's version carried a different tone, gentler, slower, as if it were an apology spoken after everything had already drifted too far away. The song topped the country charts, crossed into the pop charts, and helped him win major honors at the Grammy Awards, including Best Country Song and Best Male Country Vocal Performance. Many years later, Always on My Mind was inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame, confirming its lasting place in music history. While the public saw an artist touching one success after another, Willie moved through that period with a mixture of pride and a quiet emptiness that was difficult to name, because the more famous he became, the more he had to confront the question of what he had traded away to earn those endless rounds of applause. The stage lights grew brighter and brighter, yet behind the endless tours and dense recording schedules, another story had begun long before Willie Nelson's name was ever known in Nashville. In 1952, when Willie Nelson was only 19 years old, he met Martha Matthews in Texas. Both of them were very young, carrying far more longing than life experience. Love arrived quickly, almost clinging to them in a small town where opportunities were scarce and the future remained uncertain. They married that same year, believing that as long as they had each other and music, everything else would somehow arrange itself. In 1953, their first daughter, Lana Nelson, was born. 3 years later came Susie Nelson, and in 1958, their son Billy Hugh Nelson Jr. arrived. During the early years, their home was not entirely without laughter. There were evenings when the radio played softly. Willie held his guitar and sang for his wife and children, and Martha believed that the man she had chosen would one day succeed enough to lift the family out of hardship. But dreams did not pay the bills. Willie had to travel farther and more often to earn money, playing music in bars and taking on whatever work he could find. Martha stayed behind with 3 small children, a cold kitchen, and debts that continued to grow. The feeling of being left behind slowly crept into every meal and every argument. Alcohol entered the house as a form of escape, and conflicts were no longer limited to words. Willie later spoke about a time when he was tied up in bed sheets and beaten with a broom by Martha during a furious outburst. He also admitted that on one occasion, drunk and angry, he threw Martha into a river and immediately jumped in after her to pull her back out. These were not stories told merely for shock value. They revealed 2 young people struggling with disappointment, poverty, and the fear of abandonment in deeply flawed ways. Martha was not a simple villain, just as Willie was not merely a victim of circumstance. Both carried their own wounds, and when placed together, those wounds did not heal. They collided. By the early 1960s, the distance between them could no longer be bridged with apologies or a new song. In 1962, the marriage ended. The 3 children remained between 2 worlds, while Willie continued down the road of music with a heavy awareness of his roles as husband and father. The absence that had fractured his own childhood now appeared in the lives of his children. No one needed to point it out. Willie began to realize that he was repeating the very thing that had hurt him most, leaving when the people at home needed him the most. After that first collapse, Willie Nelson entered Nashville as a man who had just lost a family while carrying ambitions larger than himself. Amid recording studios and small stages in the early 1960s, he met Shirley Collie, a country singer who already held a modest place in the industry. Calm, perceptive, and far more familiar with the rhythm of an artist's life than most people. They met while Willie was still struggling to find his footing, and Shirley did not just see the songwriter who wrote songs for others. She also saw the man behind those melancholy love songs. Their connection came quickly, perhaps because both understood what it meant to live beneath bright stage lights while still feeling alone. In 1963, they married. For Willie, it was a chance to begin again after the chaotic years with Martha. At that time, Tennessee seemed like a home that might finally hold him in place. Shirley and Willie performed together, appeared together on programs, and stood side by side on stage like a harmonious, artistic couple. In their new house, there was music, there were rare, quiet evenings, and there was the sense that life might move at a slower rhythm. Shirley believed in her husband's talent and supported him during the years when Nashville remained uncertain about that voice that lingered slightly behind the beat. Yet the rhythm of touring never stopped. Long journeys, nights in recording studios, and encounters outside the marriage began to fill the empty spaces between them. By the late 1960s, and as Willie grew busier and spent more time away from home, a quiet truth began to take shape beyond Shirley's sight. The turning point did not arrive with a loud confrontation. One day, Shirley opened a hospital bill and saw the name Paula Carleen Nelson alongside the name Connie Kupke. It was not a rumor, not a whisper, but an official document confirming the existence of a child and an extramarital relationship. Willie admitted that Connie was his lover and Paula was his daughter. The betrayal required no further explanation. The house that had once been filled with music grew silent. There was no dramatic scene, no furious arguments stretching across the newspapers. The distance between them simply grew until it could no longer be filled. In 1971, the marriage ended. Shirley stepped away from the role of the artist's wife, standing beside Willie on stage, while Willie moved forward into another chapter of his life, carrying a new fracture, deeper and quieter than anything the public could see. The house in Tennessee closed behind him, yet the emptiness in Willie Nelson's life did not wait for him to regain stability before opening the door to another relationship. In the final years of his marriage to Shirley Collie, when he was increasingly lost between stages, recording studios, and personal conflicts, Connie Kupke appeared. She worked in music media, not as a star and not under the spotlight, and because of that, she saw Willie not only as a rising artist, but as a man exhausted from constantly having to prove himself. The relationship began while Willie was still Shirley's husband. That alone caused Connie to be viewed through the simplified lens of the other woman. Yet the reality was far more complex. Willie entered that period with a torn state of mind, simultaneously successful and empty, praised by crowds, yet feeling as though he belonged nowhere. Connie did not arrive like a storm, but like a point of stillness. In 1969, their daughter Paula Carleen Nelson was born. The existence of a child could not remain hidden forever, and it was the hospital bill that Shirley opened, which turned a secret into a public truth. In 1971, after his divorce from Shirley, Willie married Connie. At that time, he stood at a major crossroads in his career, leaving Nashville and gradually discovering a new voice in Texas. In 1973, their second daughter, Amy Lee Nelson, was born. The two girls grew up in a home filled with music, yet one that could never be completely separated from their father's long journeys on the road. Connie became the quiet pillar of the household. She cared for Paula and Amy, maintained the rhythm of daily family life, and carried the burden of stability so that Willie could devote nearly all his energy to the albums that were redefining country music. The Austin era and the rise of the outlaw country movement pushed Willie to extraordinary heights, with records selling millions and tours following one after another. At the same time, the rhythm of family life began drifting away from stability. As fame increased, the performance schedule grew heavier and the number of nights away from home multiplied. Connie remained behind, with dinners missing one person and daughters asking when their father would return. Willie never lacked affection for his family, yet he still belonged more to the road than to the house. The old pattern repeated itself in a different form, less explosive than before, but stretched out in silence. After nearly 17 years together, the marriage ended in 1988. There were no dramatic scenes across newspaper headlines, and only two people gradually accepting that the distance between them had grown beyond repair. Willie later admitted many times that he had never stopped loving Connie and that she had given him a level of patience greater than he believed he deserved. In his memory, Connie was not merely his third wife. She was the person who stood amid the wreckage of the most turbulent years of his life and kept a place for him to return to, even when he himself did not stay long enough to protect it. In the late 1980s, as the marriage with Connie closed and Willie Nelson's career still spun between stage lights and pressure, a new face entered his life in a quieter way than anything that had happened before. Annie D'Angelo was working at the time as a makeup artist on film and music productions. They met on a set around 1986, not in the atmosphere of a loud romance, but in the busy rhythm of work where each of them carried a past that had not yet settled. Annie did not come into Willie's life as a sudden impulse or a temporary compensation. She was much younger than him, yet her steadiness did not depend on fame or spotlight. With Annie, Willie did not need to perform the role of a legendary artist or a man who always had to keep moving forward. She did not try to change him or demand grand promises. And her presence alone created a different rhythm, slower, less dramatic, but more enduring. In 1988, their first son, Lucas Autry Nelson, was born. 2 years later came Jacob Micah Nelson. The boys grew up among guitars, recording studios and tour buses, but also within the effort of a father who had already endured too many broken chapters. In 1991, Willie and Annie married. The timing was far from easy. The Internal Revenue Service was seizing his assets over an enormous tax debt. In that same year, his son, Billy Hugh Nelson Jr., from his first marriage died in a tragedy that shook the entire family. Willie entered this new marriage not under the sunlight of success, but in the middle of a storm of loss and crisis. Annie stayed through that period, not through loud declarations, but by standing beside him when his property was being seized, when devastating news arrived, and when the media dug into the details of his debts. And their love was not built on the illusion that the past could be erased, but on the acceptance that those wounds would always remain. With Annie, Willie began to change the way he showed up within his family. He spent more time with his sons, trying not to repeat the image of the absent father that had haunted both his own childhood and his earlier marriages. The family he built under the roof with Annie was not perfect, yet it carried a different feeling. Willie no longer saw the house as merely a pause between two journeys. He learned to sit still longer, to listen more, and to see in the eyes of Lucas and Micah a chance to rewrite his role as a father. Annie did not transform him into a different person. She helped him understand that being held within a home was something that could never be taken lightly, and that running forever was not always the only way to live. While Annie D'Angelo and their 2 young sons were becoming the most fragile source of support in his private life, another wave arrived from the federal government. In the early 1990s, and Willie Nelson faced a massive tax debt that at one point was reported to reach about $16.7 million and eventually surged to more than $30 million once penalties and interest were added. Failed investments, poorly controlled financial decisions, and the complicated management structures of the entertainment industry pushed him into a tightening trap. Houses, assets, and personal belongings were gradually seized. Willie Nelson's name appeared not on music charts, but in the records of the Internal Revenue Service. The guitar named Trigger, the symbol that had accompanied him for decades, was also placed on the list of items at risk of confiscation. Willie refused to allow it to fall into someone else's hands. At a moment when his property was being sealed and his reputation was viewed with suspicion, he faced the option many artists had taken before him: declaring bankruptcy. Willie refused. He decided to repay every dollar. To do that, he turned to the very thing that had brought him this far: his voice and his audience. The IRS tapes, "Who'll Buy My Memories," emerged as an almost surreal chapter in American music history. An artist who had once sold millions of records was forced to record a special album to sell to the government in order to pay his tax debt. The recording was first distributed through telephone orders and television advertisements before later receiving an official release through a record label. It was not a glamorous project. There was no major promotional campaign, just a man sitting with his guitar, singing songs as if recounting his own fate. Night after night, Willie continued touring, increasing the number of shows, pouring his remaining energy into turning applause into legitimate cash to pay off his debt. By 1993, after numerous negotiations and payments, the debt with the IRS was finally settled. That same year, Willie Nelson was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame. The image of him standing among the legends of the genre he had once disrupted carried a very different meaning compared with the 1970s. No longer the outsider challenging the system, he had become an official part of the legacy he once defied. In 2000, Willie received the Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award. The honor did not simply recognize hit songs or record sales. It acknowledged the endurance of an artist who had lived through the most public rises and falls imaginable. In the early 2000s, he also showed that he was not living on nostalgia. In 2002, Mendocino County Line, a collaboration with Lee Ann Womack, I won a Grammy for Best Country Collaboration with Vocals, returning him to the position of an award-winning artist rather than someone honored only for past achievements. Around the same time, numerous tribute concerts and celebrations dedicated to Willie reflected the status of a cultural symbol deeply embedded in popular culture. In 2003, Beer for My Horses with Toby Keith unexpectedly climbed to #1 on the country charts, proving that the name Willie Nelson could still compete in a market that had changed dramatically. He did not stand outside the game of the younger generation. He entered it with the ease of someone who had lived long enough not to fear comparison. By 2012, the Country Music Association created the Willie Nelson Lifetime Achievement Award and presented it for the first time, placing his name directly on an honor recognizing lifetime contributions. A rare circle had closed, from a man once doubted in Nashville to the artist whose name the industry used to define lasting achievement. Throughout that journey, applause was no longer merely a reward. It became both motivation and pressure. In his career after the 1990s was not a dramatic cinematic comeback, but rather a continuous stretch of labor by a man who understood that fame could be stripped away, assets could be seized, yet a voice, if it could still rise, remained the one thing no one could truly take from him. After surviving financial crisis and entering a new century with both recognition and challenges, Willie Nelson did not choose to live on past achievements. In 2015, he became the first country artist to receive the Library of Congress Gershwin Prize for Popular Song, one of the most prestigious honors recognizing long-term contributions to American popular music. The ceremony took place in Washington, where songs once written during poor nights in Texas were now placed alongside the legacy of George Gershwin and Ira Gershwin. The moment carried deep meaning. Willie no longer belonged solely to country music, but was recognized as part of the broader American song tradition. 1 year later, summertime. Willie Nelson sings Gershwin won a Grammy in the category Best Traditional Pop Vocal Album. In his 80s, he recorded songs once associated with legendary voices without trying to compete or display technical brilliance. His voice had deepened with age, his breath no longer as strong as during the red-headed stranger era, yet the weight of experience gave each phrase a different gravity. Audiences were not hearing a singer trying to preserve his peak form. They were hearing a man who had endured enough loss to understand the value of every classic melody. In the years that followed, Willie continued releasing albums at a pace that surprised many younger artists. In 2022, A Beautiful Time won the Grammy for Best Country Album, proving that he was not honored merely for the past, but still recognized for new recordings and compositions. At nearly 90 years old, he still appeared on stage with Trigger, even though he had to cancel some shows due to declining health. In 2023, Willie Nelson was officially inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, stepping into another space of recognition that had once stood outside the borders of country music. His 90th birthday was marked by a major concert gathering numerous artists and by a feature documentary. Not as a farewell, but as confirmation that he was still present. The period of 2024 to 2025 continued to demonstrate a rare endurance. And Willie still released new albums, still received Grammy nominations, and still performed selected tours. His body no longer responded as it once had. He had faced lung problems and had to reduce smoking while changing certain habits. Yet he did not completely withdraw. His presence on stage now carried more symbolic meaning, each performance acting as a reminder that age does not necessarily equal silence. Alongside music, Farm Aid has remained a constant thread throughout his life. Since 1985, the program he co-founded with Neil Young and John Mellencamp has raised more than $60 million to support family farmers across the United States. Each year, Willie still appears on the Farm Aid stage, not as an honorary guest, but as the person keeping the flame alive. For him, it is not just a music event, but a continuation of the childhood once tied to cotton fields and working hands. Willie's activities outside music have always come with controversy. He has been arrested multiple times for marijuana during his career, openly supported legalization, and even participated in business ventures related to the cannabis industry. His political views, from speaking out against war to supporting Democratic candidates, have led some conservative country fans to turn away. Those choices were not marketing strategies. They reflected the character of a man unaccustomed to remaining silent out of fear of losing fans. The image of Willie Nelson, therefore, always stands between two roles: musical legend and controversial public figure. Now in his 90s, he no longer needs to prove anything about record sales or awards. Platinum records, Grammys, and prestigious honors have long sat on the shelf. What remains is presence, a musician still stepping onto the stage with silver hair, a deeper voice, and eyes that do not look away. Willie Nelson continues to live and work the way he chose from the days when Nashville criticized his voice, not reshaping himself to fit the mold, accepting loss, accepting controversy, and accepting that the road he walks will always leave some people behind. Standing in his 90s, when many of his contemporaries have already stepped away from the spotlight, Willie Nelson has not chosen silence. Entering 2025, and he continues to appear on selected tour dates of the Outlaw Music Festival, the traveling concert series he himself founded and has maintained for many years. The length of his performances may now be adjusted to suit his physical condition, and at times shows must be canceled because of respiratory problems or prolonged fatigue. Yet the image of him walking onto the stage with his guitar trigger repeats like a familiar ritual. It is no longer the explosive energy of youth, but the steady rhythm of a man who understands that each time he raises his voice could be the last. In the recording studio, Willie has not stopped either. During the period of 2024 to 2025, he continues releasing new albums, maintaining a pace of writing and recording that surprises many younger artists. His recent projects have still received positive critical response and have appeared in award nomination lists, showing that he is not honored only for the past. His voice has grown thinner, his breath shorter, yet the slow phrasing slightly behind the beat, once criticized in Nashville, has now become an irreplaceable signature. Farm Aid remains a yearly gathering point. 40 years after co-founding it with Neil Young and John Mellencamp, Willie continues to stand on its stage, calling for support for American family farmers. More than $60 million has been raised over the decades, and 2025 is no exception. For him, it is not an honorary obligation, but a promise that has never been forgotten. Alongside music, Willie continues participating in documentary films, extended interviews, memoir publications, and cultural projects reflecting on his legacy. His views on cannabis, politics, and social issues remain unchanged, even though they continue to irritate a portion of conservative country audiences. He does not adjust his positions to retain fans, nor does he soften himself to please the majority. At the age of 92, Willie Nelson is no longer racing the charts. He exists as a living presence within the history of American music. still stepping onto stages, still recording, still provoking debate, and still maintaining the way of life that has followed him since the days he was considered an outsider. When an artist lives long enough to become the memory of several generations, their legacy no longer rests solely within charts or golden trophies. For Willie Nelson, that legacy is woven from contradictions. A voice once criticized as being offbeat, yet redefining how country music could be sung. A man once pursued by the government over seized assets who still became a symbol of freedom. An outsider to Nashville, who was ultimately honored within every powerful institution of the American music industry. And he helped create and shape the outlaw country movement, opening doors for artists who refused to be molded by the conventions of the Nashville sound. He wrote songs that entered the American songbook, recorded by hundreds of voices across genres, from country to pop, from jazz to rock. He demonstrated that country music was not merely the sound of conservative tradition, but could also become a voice of protest, of human rights, of farmers, and of those living on society's margins. Willie's legacy also lies in endurance. More than 6 decades of recording, hundreds of albums, dozens of Grammy Awards, countless gold and platinum records, and honors ranging from the Country Music Hall of Fame to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Yet those numbers do not tell the whole story. What truly distinguishes him is the ability to rise again after each fall, from poverty, rejection in Nashville, broken marriages, the loss of a son, the tax crisis, to the political controversies that have followed him throughout his life. Willie Nelson has never been a perfect figure. He is a man marked by scars, by mistakes, by choices that have often made others uncomfortable. That is precisely what makes him real. He has never tried to please everyone, never polished the past, never hidden his failures. Instead, he allows his music to carry both his light and his darkness. When he steps onto a stage in his 90s, his long silver hair falling over his shoulders, the guitar trigger worn by decades of use, the audience does not simply hear a song. They witness the life of a man who has lived fully with every contradiction it contains. And perhaps what ultimately makes Willie Nelson a legend is not that he has never fallen, but that he has never pretended he did not fall.